There have been so many Resident Evil games throughout history, and with the series it's been so up and so down, it seems every fan has their own idea of which game was best. I mean, with RE8 right around the corner, I'm going to throw my hat in the ring. Welcome to ChaosGaming, everybody. Make sure you're following the page with those notifications on. Share this with a fellow Resident Evil fan, and today, we're going to make it extra spicy. We are going to include the remakes of RE1, 2, and 3, making 10 games in total, ranking them from the worst to the best. You let me know if you agree or disagree. Let's start off at the absolute worst. At the bottom of the barrel, Resident Evil 6. Coming in at dead last is one of the most widely hated games in the entire franchise. I mean, this was an easy pick for me. Released 9 years ago, it tried to be the best of both worlds between classic RE horror and more modern RE action. The game had a handful of different campaigns that all came together to tell this bigger story, but fans were not happy with the end product. The horror, it was laughable. The action, it was way too over the top, and the game just did not feel like Resident Evil. It also didn't help that RE6 had a ton of bizarre gameplay features that took away from the experience, and overall, it felt like Capcom was just going further and further in the wrong direction. The abysmal reception to RE6 was what led Capcom to completely rework the series a few years later, and I'm glad they did. So I guess I'm glad that Resident Evil 6 sucked. Next up, the RE3 remake. Now, let me first say, it looks incredible, and it has some good gameplay. However, compared to the few games that came before it, it's hard not to feel like this was a step backwards. I think it's the only remake in the series that actually is inferior to the original. Hear me out. It dropped in 2020. It followed in the footsteps of RE2's remake. You were playing as Jill Valentine, trying to survive a zombie apocalypse while being constantly hunted by a new bioweapon called the Nemesis. The original RE3 is a fan favorite. I've played through the entire game myself. It had a unique concept, terrifying monster design, but the remake made a lot of changes that didn't have to happen. Shorter length, much shallower gameplay, and very, very bizarre story pacing. You can definitely tell this game was rushed through development, and it was a huge letdown after the great 1-2 punch of RE7 and RE2, the remake. And hopefully, Capcom takes all the criticism of this game to heart when it's time to make another remake, because RE4, they better do it right. At number 8, Resident Evil 5. Now, it's a weird game to talk about. It was released as a follow-up to RE4, obviously, which was a revolutionary game that many consider to be one of the best horror games ever made. Capcom had giant shoes to fill, but instead of actually trying to fill those shoes, they went a completely different direction. It's not a horror game at all. Instead, it's a co-op third-person shooter with zombies. The gameplay of RE4 was brought over, altered a bit to make it work better with a more action-oriented setting, but overall, fans were pretty turned off by the dramatic shift in the tone and style. Upon release, RE5 was widely hated by the community, but in recent years, people have actually revisited it and they gave it a little more appreciation, which happens more times than not. So if you want a horror game, don't play RE5. If you want a good co-op shooter, go play RE5. It's weird. At number 7, Resident Evil 1. Now hear me out. I love the original Resident Evil, but I can even admit it has not aged well. Released in '96 for the PS1 and the PC, that's where it all started. You played as a couple agents stuck in a strange mansion while investigating the disappearance of their colleagues, only to find themselves face to face with zombies, monsters, and lots of juicy conspiracies. RE1 had a perfect blend of cheesy acting, over-the-top monsters, and legitimately terrifying tension moments and sequences. It was a huge influence on the industry and a massive success. So why do I put it at number 7? Like I said, the game didn't age well. There's a reason why you only hear about the RE1 remake and not the original. I mean, the blocky visuals, the choppy animations, the awful voice acting, it destroyed some of the immersion, and it definitely looks like a game from the mid-90s. However, even with that being said, RE1's foundation is fantastic, and the gameplay, it aged extremely well. I think 7's fair. At number 6, Resident Evil 3. Some may disagree with me, but I think the original RE3 belongs at number 6 today. It changed a lot of stuff in the formula. The gameplay was more fine-tuned from RE2, and of course it introduced us to Nemesis, a now iconic villain who added so much tension to the story. But it was also considerably shorter than previous games in the series, and the story wasn't quite as tight as 1 and 2. Now, in terms of visuals and gameplay, it was way ahead of its time. It's still impressive to this day, and like I said, Nemesis is a fantastic villain. He added a ton of new dynamics to the gameplay, but it's getting the number 6 spot today due to the short length and the less engaging story. Now we start to round the turn into the better. At number 5, Resident Evil 2. The original RE2 was a fantastic sequel, and if you ask me, which you're here, so I think it's one of the best sequels in gaming history. It was a classic example of taking a formula from a first game, but amping up the details to make it much deeper, richer, and terrifying, but also holding on to what worked. The game, this time, followed both Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield. They tried to escape Raccoon City, following the start of the zombie apocalypse. Now, the gameplay from the first is brought back. You've got more options, more puzzles, more weapons. The story was expanded upon, new narratives, multiple protagonists, all kinds of story arcs. It was great. It was a fantastic game, and while the visuals and voice acting don't age very well, that's to be expected, I think it's one of the best games of its time. At number 4, the RE1 Remake. Now, released in 2002 for the GameCube, it was meant to take the horror legacy of that original game, but update it to be less cheesy and a little better aged. Did they succeed? Absolutely. It took the gameplay of the original, it tightened the screws a bit to make it feel even better while also keeping the best parts intact. Plus, the graphics were dramatically improved, and if you ask me, this is one of the best looking GameCube games ever released. Plus, double plus, there were new gameplay mechanics, new puzzles, slightly tweaked script, and a greatly improved voice acting. Many people consider the RE1 Remake to be the scariest entry in the entire franchise. And since it was released in 2002, it's been ported to 7 other platforms. You can play it pretty much anywhere. Now we get into our top 3. Let me know if you agree or disagree with this and if you'd switch it around. Resident Evil 7 at number 3. Now, following the critical flop of RE6, Capcom needed to go back to basics. Fans had no faith in the brand anymore, and the studio had completely lost their way. So, they brought back the formula. No more action, no more explosions, no more giant shootouts, no more cheesy conspiracies, none of it. It was time to bring Resident Evil back to its roots. RE7 was released in 2017, was basically a full restart of the IP. You played as a man named Ethan Winters. He goes out searching for his wife, and he finds himself trapped on a creepy plantation filled with monsters, cannibals, and whores. It was a much smaller scale than other Resident Evil games, which also makes it way more tense. I know it did have some flaws, the short length and the underwhelming ending, but just about everything else was perfect. It was one of the best games of that year, and it finally put the Resident Evil franchise back on track. At number 2, the RE2 Remake. Released in 2019, people were nervous, myself included. Fans loved RE2. They loved the RE1 Remake, but when Capcom announced they were completely reimagining Part 2, I was nervous. A lot of us were worried they were going to completely ruin the original's charm and horror, but shockingly, it was the exact opposite. It was one of the best games of 2019, an improvement over the original in almost every way. Instead of a fixed camera experience with tank controls, it was now a third-person game with much closer to the beloved RE4 formula. The RE2 Remake took the world of the original and translated it into a brand new perspective with absolutely stunning visuals. It was a tremendous success. And at number 1 today, for me, Resident Evil 4. This is as good as it's getting. I mean, well, it's as good as it has been so far. Released in 2005, critical acclaim, completely changed the industry. The story was stripped back to the basics. The gameplay was reworked. No more tank controls, no more fixed cameras. It was now a third-person shooter and one of the first of its kind. The story managed to keep that same level of Resident Evil cheese, while the monster design was terrifying. The combat was high stakes and it felt satisfying. It's widely regarded as one of the greatest video games ever made, and you can still feel its influence in other third-person games. Ever since 2005, Capcom has been trying to recapture the greatness of RE4, and honestly, I don't know if they're going to remake it or not. Maybe just remaster it, re-release it, but maybe don't remake this one. The game doesn't need to be remade. It doesn't need to be reworked. It's perfect. Maybe, yeah, just leave it alone. And there you have it. That is ranking every single Resident Evil game from worst to best. That is not an easy list to do. Let me know if you agree or disagree, and I'll see you soon.